Hi everyone, I'm Regdren and I'm here to talk about the action side of the action RPG that is Dungeon Fighter Online. The gameplay of DFO is heavily based on arcade-style 2D brawler games, so if you're new to that genre then this guide might be helpful for you. Chapter 1: Awareness. Gameplay in Dungeon Fighter Online is based on avoiding attacks. You can get heavily punished for being hit even in the early game, so in order to survive you have to pay close attention to how monsters behave. Most monsters like to move to a very particular distance and angle to attack you. Observing this can help you figure out what skill is best for hitting them and when you can approach them safely. This extends to when you are hitting monsters as well. It's easy to focus on your attacks, the amount of damage you're dealing, and the flashy effects that you paid skill points for. However, once you get used to the movements of your character, it's better to instead look for enemies moving behind you or attacking from far away. That way you know when you have to end your combo early and avoid damage. This skill is important throughout the entire game. As for the exact methods to avoid damage, that's covered in the next few parts of this guide. One thing that isn't really explained by the game but merits a lot of attention is super armor. When a creature gets a flashing yellow and orange outline, attacks will deal damage to it but won't interrupt what it's doing. That's called super armor. Pay attention to what makes a monster go into super armor so that you can avoid getting hit by something you can't interrupt. Some character moves give super armor as well, and you can use them to get out of tough situations. One final note about super armor is that some enemies have permanent super armor against ranged attacks. You can tell by the large red barrier that appears when the monster is hit. You'll occasionally have to knock them down and get some distance to avoid being cornered. Chapter 2: Mobility. You have to move around a lot in Dungeon Fighter Online, and just running is not always the best way. Check your moves closely because everyone has an attack that moves them around in some way. Things like a Slayer's triple slash, Gunner's slide attack, female mage's uncharged palm blast, and even a fighter's normal attacks while holding down the direction key can move the character faster than just running. The skills you use depend at least somewhat on your subclass. A monk has a lot more options for mobility than a crusader, for example. But definitely keep at least a couple of skill points in mobility even if the skills don't do much damage, because saving you from taking damage is always valuable. If you don't have space to move around properly, a quick knockdown move like the Slayer's neutral wave slash can sometimes provide the space you need. Paired with class-specific mobility is an important option for every class, the backstep. A lot of melee attacks can be cancelled into a backstep, so if you suddenly need to move, the backstep can take you out of a slow attack animation and allow you to avoid damage. You also count as being in the air, so you can use certain air skills immediately. The Witch's Broom Air Dash, for example. The command is down and jump, but you can assign it to a hotkey if that's more comfortable for you. On that note, don't forget your normal jump. There are some patterns that are a lot easier to avoid by jumping than by trying to sidestep or run. Some classes also have effective jump attacks that allow you to stay on the offense while retaining mobility. Chapter 3: Grouping. I mentioned enemy movement before from a mostly defensive point of view. Once you get a good feel for where enemies want to go, you can use this knowledge offensively as well. Gather all or most of the enemies to one side of you in one spot, and you can hit them all at once, saving time and mana. Grouping enemies also puts you in less overall danger, since the enemies in the room are too busy getting pummeled to stab you in the back. Just be careful about enemies that use super armor. You want to start your attack from a range where they won't make themselves impossible to interrupt or juggle. That could be a disaster, since if you get put in hit stun and the enemies are all grouped up, you could just get KO'd right there. Hey, this reminds me of the Streets of Rage 1 Path and remake right after the elevator scene. You get surrounded really easily, but Adam's reach helps a lot, because if you can get them all on one side, you can use his level 3 dash to punish a group even on the other side of the screen. But you should still attach his level 0 dash to one of the buttons, because it executes a lot...
Dungeon Fighter Online, focus!
Right, yeah. That was my brother. Moving on. Here's my advice about conserving mana. You pretty much should not do that. Sure, there will occasionally be super expensive skills you won't use all the time, but you'll pretty much always be using some sort of skill attack when fighting. Compare the consequences of running out of mana and running out of health. Even in the Berserker's case, killing enemies quickly will reduce your time bleeding away health. Chapter 4. Throws. When you're in a bad spot, surrounded, or right in front of super armored enemies about to smack you in the face, use a throw. Landing a throw gives you precious invulnerability, and most throws knock down surrounding enemies or put you in a safer place in some other way. They also pull enemies right out of super armor. These properties make throws an excellent survival tool even if your character doesn't specialize in them. And just about every character has access to at least one, except for female elementalist and summoner. If you're surrounded as one of those two, good luck, buddy. Some enemies are completely unthrowable. It's tough to tell which enemies have this property at a glance because some very large enemies can be thrown. A good general rule is that if an enemy is impossible to knock down, it's also impossible to throw. Unless you have Grab Cannon or Manteau, then go nuts, I guess. Also of note is that some large enemies, especially bosses, can be both unthrowable and in permanent super armor. You'll need to study their attack patterns to figure out when and where they're safe to attack. I would not recommend long strings of attacks against these enemies. Just hit them a couple of times and then back off for another chance, unless you're very familiar with the times you can get away with hitting them. A boss might recover some health while you're backed off, but don't let that bait you into putting yourself at risk. That's it for today's guide. Feedback in the comments is welcome, and don't forget to click the sub for rich, meaty content.